This interview is being conducted for the Ploughing Up Our Past project. My name is Kay McMeekin and the respondent is Robert Stevenson, and the date is 6th of April 2021, and we're doing the interview on Zoom. So thank you, Robert, very much for agreeing to be interviewed for this project. Could you please confirm your name?
I am Robert Michael Stevenson.
Can you tell me the year of your birth, please?
1956.
And for the record, in just a few words, what's your connection to the farms project?
Joining through the history club, and quite a keen interest in the project as it is going. It's certainly my sphere of interest, and all that my family heritage involves. So I'm happy to try and make a contribution.
Has your family always been in farming?
Yeah, very boring pedigree. I can't find anyone in my family tree who's not a farmer's daughter or a farmer or a farmer's son. So it's pretty well pure farming.
Yeah, and the family farm was at Chang. How long was the family at Chang?
151 years we managed to clock up until 2 years, just gone 2 years, 29th of March 2019 we left. So it's just rushed in the time, but that's 2 years gone already. Yeah. The first Stevenson at Chang was John Stevenson, who took out the lease, and there's various dates, but I think I've tied it down to a lease starting November, 28th November, the traditional November term when leases began, and that would be access to the fields for ploughing and things, but not until the 28th of May did they gain access to the steading and the grassland. And that seems to tie in, the previous people in Chang were Wardrops, and there's a death of an elderly wife in March 1868, and that's confirmed there's a gravestone in the old cemetery in Cumnock, and that confirms that. So the Wardrops were still there after this November lease was enacted. And then there was the newspaper clipping that I found about the day's ploughing, when 70 neighbours came and helped to plough the new parts of the new farm, and that was in January 1868. But the connection with the district or the area goes back a little bit longer. John Stevenson was the eldest son in the family at Ladyyard, Turbolton, and seemed to find a girlfriend next door in Strawhorn of Mossbog, and this was in 1849, and they got married in April 49, but lo and behold, their son Alan was born in September 1849. So reading between the lines, he had to look for a job. As the eldest son, he should have inherited the lease of Ladyyard. So in the 1851 census, he rolls up as a farm servant to the Boswells of Gorallen, and in the home farm, it would be the farmhouse at the back of the mansion house, and he's there with his 1-year-old son Alan. But by 1861, 10 years later, he's the farm overseer, and we know that he also took on the factorship for the Somervilles of Sorn Castle in the 1860s, when poor Mary Ritchie Strawhorn died. She died at Sorn in 1864. So they moved to the hillhead of Sorn, the sort of factor's house stroke home farm for Sorn Castle. And so this was him coming back to his roots. But yet in that time, he had taken on the tenancy of Gorallen Home Farm. So he was farming in his own right. And it would only be about 50 acres, maybe maximum. But when he got Chang, which would be about 100, 110 acres maybe, it's in the newspaper clipping, it makes that clear that he's taking on additional ground. But they don't seem to have arrived back at Chang there's a daughter born at Sawn as late as 1872 in June, and poor wee soul, she dies at Chang. The first family event is her death in January 1873 as a 6-month-old baby, and he lost another daughter aged 13, possibly I think from diphtheria, but he lost 2 daughters within a fortnight, and that was the first of his children that he had lost. But by this time he had married again when Mary Strawhorn died in 1864, 4th of January. He, by Christmas Day 1865, he was married again. So the wee girl that died was a daughter of the second wife, the Sloane wife, and that's the family from which I descend from. So quite complicated. 2 families, 14 children in total, 15 if you count a stillborn twin, 9 sons who all survived, and 5 girls, of which 3 didn't make it into adulthood. But the boys all seemed to survive, and interestingly followed a variety of careers. So that's so we count I would say from January 1868, which makes it 151 years of history at Chang.
Fantastic. Okay. Was it always a dairy farm?
Yes. I found a notes by Dad in the calendar where he claimed that the Ayrshire herd, although it was registered as pedigree from 1906, and one of the cows that was put in was born 1900, so that's about as far back as we could go. But Dad makes the claim in a calendar notes that the herd were descended from cows taken over from the Boswells, so these would be the Boswells cows on the home farm, and Dad makes the claim that his grandfather had taken these over, and that was the root of the origin of the herd. So they seem to have been dairying. I mean, there's a Boer agreement for the Boswells for a man Thompson, where he's got to keep, I think it's like 10 or a dozen cows in the wee byre along at Garallan Cottage, and it lays out that you know, how the fodder will be provided from the farm, the turnips, the cabbages, the hay, and in return he's got to provide the mansion house with milk, butter, cheese, and so it's a sort of wee family enterprise. So even then, back in the 1860s, yes, there was dairying going on.
Right. How many of a family?
I'm the middle of 3 sons.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
I was the only one that showed any interest in the farm. The rest made their escape.
Okay. What sort of jobs did you have to do as children in the farm? Were you always roped in?
Yes, maybe less so than in some instances, but certainly summertime was hay time, and that was Dad's great worry, was getting the hay made. Not easy in a 600-700 feet up in Cumnock, trying to get grass to dry with the aid of the sun, which takes 5 days of continuously dry weather. So we were heavily involved in that, maybe a bit less so, but to begin with, of course, Dad had set up his businesses in partnership with his own brothers, and the 2 brothers, James and Willie, Dad's younger brothers, they were very much the farmers and cattle breeders. Dad concentrated on the retail dairy business and also set up the bakery and the hotel. So he was, I would say, maybe more of an entrepreneur. I mean, he started out before the war doing outside catering, and then in wartime moved into doing pit-packed lunches, these sorts of things, and then bought the hotel in 1956, basically because the hotel was in the property above where the firm offices were, and that's how his mind worked. I'll just take this over in case somebody else does. But so that was fine and dandy, but there was 3 sons at Chang, and there was only 1 son at Bankend and 1 son at Croft Head. So I think the brothers took the hint and wanted to branch out on their own. Uncle Willie, the youngest, was the first to go, and after looking lots of farms, Watson at Cumnock, Pwhairn, various places, eventually found a beautiful place down at Ballantrae, Auchenflower. So the partnership was split, and Dad and Uncle James had to pay out Uncle Willie. And then 4 years later, Uncle James did the same. He wasn't quite so adventurous. He went as far as Cooper Hill at Ochiltree, and with a good, nice farm. It came up for sale. Poor Hugh Sloan died and had 3 daughters. So the farm, there were never many farms coming on the market, so there weren't many opportunities. So with the departure of Uncle James and Uncle Willie, Dad was back farming full time, although he had, we no longer had the Bank End herd and farm, but there was still 2 dairy herds, Chang and Croft Head, and the sheep farm at Newfield. And from then on, there weren't any family summer holidays or anything, because it was, and Dad was more involved. I mean, he would, every night, if he'd been up in Glasgow at meetings, he was always at meetings, Scottish Dairy Trade Federation, Auchencruive. He was chairman of governors, board of governors at Auchencruive, with the West College, Highland Society, Milk Records. I mean, he'd be away three or 4 days a week at meetings, but at night it would be tea and then out round the byre last thing, sweep down the cows and see that there was nothing going wrong. But it certainly, our lives changed at that point. You're much more tied with a farming enterprise, which doesn't stop on a Sunday or anything like that.
So there would be a huge amount of staff there, which I suppose would mean you didn't need to do so much as a youngster.
Not as youngsters. We were tolerated. We were always wanting to get involved. you would get chased sometimes, but and that, of course, has all changed as time moved on. Yeah. I mean, I was making calculations that about what would happen, and I'd worked out that even if I went to college for 3 years, Dad was going to be 70 by the time I graduated or got out of college. And in the event, he died a couple of years before that. But that was always in the calculation, realised that, and we were conscious that we were needing to modernise the farm, and Dad didn't want to do it. He said he would leave it to me to update the place. And that the 60s and 70s were a time of great change in dairy farming and things. And we were still, I mean, when Dad died, he left me, byrefuls of cows, fed on hay and turnips and with dung and all the rest of it. And everything had to change. We had to get on to silage, and you can't feed silage easily in a byre. So you had to move to loose housing, and that meant milking cows in a parlour rather than in a byre. And you needed silage pits and methods to deal with the effluent coming out of the silage, which is highly polluting, can do terrible damage to rivers. And then you have to be on slurry because the cows are loose housed, so everything's slurry. So you need slurry tankers, not dung spread. Everything had to change. And it was
why you went from hay to silage?
It was just becoming increasingly difficult to secure. With 110 acres of hay to make. And I only remember one field getting burnt in 1974, and then 75, Dad's last year was a beautiful year. 76 was a fantastic year. We made all the hay in 12 days. Uncle Willie was coming up by that time after Dad had died, and he said, "You remember this, you've made 110 acres of hay in 12 days. You maybe never do that in your life again." And he was right. But so it was just, but hay, you didn't cut the hay till into July, till it was stemmy enough to dry in the sunshine. But the mere fact that it's getting stemmy means it's less digestible, it's lower in protein, and you were limited to the amount of fertilizer you could put on. Because if you grew a very sappy, leafy crop of hay, you could hardly win it. Whereas with silage, you could make a first cut at the end of May and a second cut mid-July. You could put as much fertilizer on as you like. You were cutting it before the seed heads formed, so it's a higher protein, higher energy feed. So instead of just the cow just getting maintenance from her hay ration, you could actually get maintenance and maybe a gallon or even 2 gallons of milk. So it altered the economics of the job. And as all the neighbours and things made that switch, the price of milk was no longer increasing to reflect the cost. So there had to be efficiencies and cost savings made.
Yeah.
But it was hugely capital intensive. And that you couldn't really, I mean, you were talking about a couple of £1,000 per cow place to put up that sort of modern setup even back then.
Gosh.
And that was only possible with the grants, which by that time had come in and from Europe. And there was a 40% grant available to build silage pits, slurry tankers and things. So that was the race. I was trying to get finished at college, which was 77. And we tried to get these plans designed, what we're going to do. They wanted to combine the two herds so to cut down the labour problems. I mean, you had a man and his wife at Croft Head with 40 cows, and it was a nightmare all the time, and uneconomic as well. So the idea was to combine the two herds. So instead of having 3 men for 130 cows, we were going to have 2 men for 150 cows, and shorter working hours and all the rest of it. So that was dependent on this grant, but to get the designs drawn up, decide where we were going to put the building, get the contracts placed, and always there was this fear that the grants would stop because the milk production was burgeoning in Europe, and it was obvious that they might pull the rug from that, which actually happened. We managed it with about a year to spare. The parlour started operating in June 1979. And the grants all came off in the very early 80s. So I only just made it.
You haven't mentioned your mother. I imagine her workload would change at that point then as well, would it?
Yes, she got involved. She, as I said before, she had attended Doe School in Edinburgh, Athol Crescent. Yeah. And she said latterly, "Oh, I should have done the institutional management course," because she ended up running a hotel. She shouldn't have done the household management course at all, had she known what the future held. But as I say, Dad bought the hotel in April 1956 when Mum was 7 months pregnant with me, and I think she wasn't the most enthusiastic. Her mind was in other things at that point, but so she did get roped in a bit, to advise in decor and food, because the hotel it was quite basic. It sort of specialised in cycling clubs, and it was a temperance hotel. It didn't have a licence, so Dad's wasn't that keen on drink at all and didn't like the idea of being a licensee. So I think he struggled away for about a year or 2 years and then admitted defeat and had to become a licensee because he couldn't have functions. And then, but his favourite thing in all the world was knocking buildings down and extending them and building a new function suite and altering all the bedrooms and things. So it was a very old Victorian building, and he knocked it about a bit, but it was always limited. The footprint, because it was upstairs from everything, access was a problem, and steep stair and lack of car parking. These were always problems. But anyway, so Mum got involved on that side, but she was very much a hands-on mother and 3 children and things. And as I say, Dad was away a lot, and Mum would be left sort of, personal assistant and on the spot and taking calls and people at the door and all the rest of it. And Dad, when we went away as a family, Dad was always anxious to get home in case the place had burnt down. He had this horrible fear, because so many, your entire winter stock of fodder was in 3 hay sheds, and it was tinder dry, and he was always these sort of nightmares. But as Mum said, as long as she was left at home, Dad was quite happy to be away. He was perfectly happy and had faith in her, and she was there. So it wasn't, but eventually she had to there was a second car bought because Dad would disappear to Glasgow in the Siddeley, and Mum was like marooned at Chang. And she was a very good driver. So eventually there was another car bought, and she at least could, especially it was to get us up and down to school and shopping and things. So, but then, as I say, when Dad died, Mum just had she held the whole thing together while I was at college, and we just got involved with trustees. Dad had about 5 or 6, an accountant, a lawyer, Uncle James, and his brother-in-law, Uncle Jim Black. Uncle James was dead by that time, but with these family and professional trustees, and there's a business of 130 employees overnight was handed to a 19-year-old and a wife. It was difficult for a few years. But when you say, I mean, when Mum came through to Chang, she'd just grown up. She was working at home on the farm at S Bank and things. But she said she arrived and Dad had a housekeeper, kind of eccentric lady who seemed to make it her business to be as difficult with Mum as she possibly could. But there were two boys in the house who were the farm workers, and they lived in the bothy, and they had ration books. This was 1952, so there was still rationing, and so Mum had all their meals to sort out and things. The housekeeper left very shortly after Mum arrived, and that was that. There were no more housekeepers, and so as I say, Mum had these boys to keep, and at that point, all the dairy girls, there were about 15 dairy girls, as we call them, the women who did the milk processing, and there were no lavatories outside. So they all came into through the kitchen from end to end and into the cloakroom and downstairs in the farmhouse to use the lavatory. So the house was this constant stream. And they also came in and spread their pieces in the morning, made their pieces in the kitchen. So Mum got the pantry made up, and she used to retreat in there and tried to bake in there, in this wee pantry off the kitchen. But as a concession, Dad built a staff canteen just before Alan was born, and the house, Mum got the house to herself just before Alan was born, which was a relief. But no, she was right in the thick of it, and then she became officially, when the hotel was bought, Dad made her a partner in the hotel, and then Dad was sole trader. But fortunately, in 1974, as soon as I turned 18. He made a partnership with me and Mum, and that was a blessing, because when he died, it meant the partnership continued. There were still two partners left, so the partnership continued as before. Otherwise, we would have had more difficulties in trying to keep the thing running.
What did
so she
your
was
brothers
involved.
go off to do? They didn't want to be farmers.
Yes, Alan disappeared as soon as he could. So 1972, I think. He shot off to Edinburgh to do medicine.
Right.
He didn't know what he wanted to do. He got good hires. He got accepted to Edinburgh, which was top of his pick. And then I think he had rather a good student life and things. And then had some resets the year Dad died, but settled down after that. The thing was that one difficulty I encountered later was that Dad had made his will in 1974, because there was, if you remember, Chancellor Healy was having his mini budgets. There was a budget every 3 months, and all the capital transfer tax came in, and the whole thing about when Uncle James died, it was under the old. That was in May 74, and he couldn't leave anything to his wife. By the time Dad died, his will had only been done a few months, but because Dad left everything, the life rent, to Mum, by that time there was transfers between a husband and wife, and it made it more possible. But there was people got caught out and we basically had to sell farms to pay death duties and things. And that's always a problem in a farm. You've got a high value asset that's not earning money like a business. It doesn't earn in proportion, and it's always difficult. But so it was a time of great flux. But anyway, so that the will was left that the farm was split equally between us three, because David was 15 at the time and Dad didn't know what he would decide to do eventually. So that's what contributed to the fact that Mum lived so long. The lawyer said they'd never seen a longer life rent. She was a widow she was married for 23 years and I think a widow for 42. And it was the longest life rent that the lawyers had seen. So in effect, Dad's will didn't come into being until she died. She had the right to the property. She couldn't do anything with the property. She couldn't alter Dad's will, but she had the right to live in it and all the rest of it as long as she lived. But then once she died, then the shares became due. So I had to sell the farm and pay out my brothers. So there wasn't really much option to finish up. But that was a hangover from the way the world was of family circumstances in 1974, which Dad couldn't foresee. But as it turned out, David went off to do accountancy in Edinburgh and then pursued a business career in Edinburgh, finishing up in fund management. So he never came home to take a part in the business and things. These were the difficulties. Dad was making his will and things, he was having to try and guess the future and be fair to the whole family.
You told me at one point your father was involved in setting up, is it the Young Farmers? When was that?
That would be, some of the very early Young Farmers Clubs got off the ground just before the war. I'm not sure if in the Ayrshire, through in the East, some of the first ones were late 30s, but the Young Farmers Club really got going after the war. And Dad was very keen on that. I mean, by that time he was too old for the Young Farmers, but obviously the office bearers and things, he was national chairman and all the rest of it. And but he was instrumental in getting a lot of these what later became regular, competitions, the stock judging at the Highland Show, cattle dressing, all these sort of things. But that was all going through the 40s and early 50s. And I say that culminated in him being awarded the MBE in 1951.
Right.
But he made a lot of friends and things from across the country in the other office bearers. But it was obviously that the club was designed for members up to 26. But at the national level, it was people in their 30s and things that were establishing them, and some older than that in many cases. But by the time the 50s came round, the Young Farmers Club were very well established. And then as a Dad sort of moved on to all the other things, college work and Highland Society and the dairy trade. I think he was the only person involved in the dairy trade who was both. He was both milk and I forgot to say the NFU was another massive part of his business, and he was convener of the milk committee, which was on the farmers' side, but he was also chairman of the Dairy Trade Federation in Scotland at a different time. But he played two roles from the two sides of the industry, whereas I don't think there was anyone else who were either on one side or the other of the because in those days there was negotiations over milk price with government and things. It was an industry where the government didn't just set the price of milk, they set the margins for all the milk retailers, and it was completely government controlled. It's unimaginable in the circumstances that we have now, but it was a follow-on from wartime controls. The government set everything, and that was just considered to be, milk was a basic necessity, and it was considered so important that the government had to have a major role. Nowadays that would be laughed at. You had
it must have been quite an unusual setup because you had visitors coming, you told me, from all over the place on a regular basis. Would that be in the 50s or the 60s or all through?
It was throughout. Well, Dad started with these. I mean, it really started very early. He set up the business retailing. The story of the milk business is Dad's father died in 1932. He was only 62, and there was a stepmother because Dad lost his mother when the children were all young. She died in 1920, age 48, with post-operative pneumonia from appendicitis. An uncomfortable thought for me now. And Dad's father's brother down in Essex had made this very successful second marriage, and I think Dad's father thought he would. Well, the grandmother, she came in 1920 and looked after the children up until she died in 1925, aged 84. But as soon as she died, Dad's father got married again, but it was unhappy, and so Dad's father died in 1932. They were just moving into the worst of the Depression. The cows all had a contagious abortion, there were brucellosis, so the cows were aborting and not milking. So there was this horrendous struggle, and the stepmother was making life as difficult as she could for them. And Dad literally didn't know what to do, but he saw the solution as getting being able to retail the milk production of the farm. But in order to do that, they had to become tuberculin attested. And that was the kind of thing the stepmother just put her foot down, and she said it was a waste of money, and she wasn't going to, she was in the business and she didn't want to have any part of that. So she dragged her feet, but they eventually managed to work round about it. But it took a couple of years to get the cattle tuberculosis free. And then with a wee bit of help from Uncle Jacob, they set up this milk bar. What was the milk bar? But it was just a baker shop sort of restaurant in the square, which was a very good location because it was where all the buses came and went. And it was supposedly the first farmer-owned milk bar doing ice cream and coffees and teas and bakery goods in Scotland, first farmer-owned. But Dad's cousins, the Sloans up in Glasgow, they had left farms down about Barmickhill and down the south of Ayrshire and gone up and set up a dairy in Glasgow. And the two sons had to go away to the war, and while they were away in the war, the daughters kept this business in Glasgow going, and they had baker shops and dairies and delivered milk, and it was a big business. And then when the sons came back from the war, it got going into a considerable scale, and they actually bought our milk prior to the formation of the milk marketing boards in 1933. Our milk was going from Dumfries House Station up to the Sloans in Glasgow. But then once the milk boards were formed, the milk boards had to be the intermediary buyer. But I think that's where Dad got some of his ideas. These Sloans had restaurants and baker shops in Glasgow, but it worked very well in Cumbernauld. So the business got established. And within, there's that film that was made by 1939, when the business was only 2.5 years on the go. Dad was having these at-home days to entertain all his customers. So he always seemed to have a sort of idea about public relations and customer relations. And also, he was very keen on fostering good staff relations. And there was this staff social club and SDF flower show and staff dances and mystery bus tours and sports nights at Chang for all the children, and an SDF children's Christmas party complete with Santa Claus and all the rest of it. It was all bells and whistles. Yeah, I mean, and the staff that ran a lot of it themselves. I mean, it was the office girls, Martha Blackwood and Mr. Falls, who was the office manager, and he ran Cumbernauld Carnival as well. He was that kind of person. But I mean, the staff did a lot of it themselves. But I mean, as I said, they even ran a bus trip through to see Mum's show of presents before the wedding.
How did your parents meet? Because she was from the east, or was it Esk Bank, did you say?
Yes, it's a very long story, but Dad was on a holiday with Uncle Stan, who made the films, shot all the films, and they were in the hotel in Rossley that the Marquis of Bute owned. What was it called? It's a big, massive hotel in Rossley, and they were there, and they got friendly with this couple who had got engaged, and they were going to go up to Glasgow to buy an engagement ring. So nothing would do that Uncle Stan and Dad drove them up to Glasgow and got them this engagement ring. So that was fine. So when the couple got married, there was the wedding. So Dad and Uncle Stan, who'd only met them on holiday, were invited to the wedding. But Mum was, there was some connection. The girl was she was, I don't know, friends with Mum through Young Farmers. So Mum rocked up at this wedding, where bizarre series of happenstance, and they met there, and that must have been about 1951, and they were engaged by, I think, December 1951. But I think Dad took his sister to Buckingham Palace to get his MBE, but I think you weren't allowed to take fiancés. It had to be a blood relation or a wife. You had to take Auntie Nan, his sister,
Right.
but that was November 51, but he was married within 6 months. So that was the story there. It was quite circumstantial, quite just a chance. But they might have met in other ways through young farmers or something. But
I was going to ask about accidents and work-related illnesses. Is there anything that you can remember? Farming accidents?
oh yes, there's a series of tragedies. Really sadly, recently there's also a problem with farm suicides, which is absolutely tragic. And down here where I am now, you can just about point to farms all round about where there's been a whole series of them, which is absolutely tragic. But farming has a very high suicide rate, but it also has an extremely high accident rate, and it's a lot to do with people working on their own, people working after they're 65. A lot of farm accidents involve people working with stock, pensioners, working with livestock or working with implements on their own. And it's a sad state of affairs, but farming hasn't made the safety adjustments that maybe other industries have been forced to. But that is the central problem, is that you've got people on their own, and working with dangerous implements. So, and then the other things like farmer's lung. One of the reasons, if you were working with mouldy hay, it's very easy to make mouldy hay, and that can leave you with a lifetime of lung trouble and things. And that was common enough amongst farming community too. A lot of vets at one time had brucellosis because they were attending cows that had aborted, and they picked up the infection. Very common, and that was a thing. It was also another name for brucellosis. It was Malta disease or something, but undulant fever it's called, and it's a kind of recurrent fever, almost malaria-like. So people, there was no cure for it. And if vets got infected, they could be laid low at regular times. But that's why Dad was massively keen to get brucellosis, and he tried to push the government he started testing privately about 1963, 1964 for to get a brucellosis eradication scheme off the ground. The official scheme didn't come in until about 1968, and it was still not. Scotland still wasn't clear in the mid 70s. It took to about 1980 before Scotland was clear, and then unfortunately TB re-entered from Ireland and has remained a problem, not so much in Scotland, but it's an absolute horrendous problem in cattle herds down south, and they're just not making any progress.
Finally, I was just going to say, could you clarify the name of the firm? It was Stevenson's Dairy Farms, is that right?
It was Stevenson's Dairy Farms, farms plural, and also S apostrophe, because it was the Stevenson's brothers. And people knew, you see, it's quite often the Chronicle would get it right, and it was always on any advertising and things, it would be S apostrophe. Mr. Clark was so particular about that, but most people would just put Stephenson's N apostrophe S. But it was J.J. and W. Stevenson, John, James and Willie Stevenson, and then it became J and J.M. Stevenson, which was John and James Murray Stevenson when Uncle Willie left, and then it was John Stevenson and Sons, the partnership thereafter. So we had various incarnations, but it was always a private. But it was never a company. It was always a unlimited liability partnership.
And the hotel was the Royal Hotel, all right?
Yes.
Uncle Jacob was Jacob
Murray. He was Dad's mother's brother. Okay. He was the youngest of the 7 Murray siblings. There was 5 daughters born, and then there was 2 sons. Okay. And Uncle John got married and had 1 son, Jim Murray. But other than that, the Murrays, the Murray name has got scarcer. But Uncle Jacob, he had this record-breaking dispersal sale at Dilgig in 1926 when cows went to America, and thereafter he seemed to be quite well off. and he was willing to help Dad. In those days, you couldn't go to a bank and say, I've got this hot shot business idea, lend me some money. That didn't happen.
Yeah.
But of course, the trouble with Uncle Jacob was that he wanted to interfere. If he lent you a sixpence, he thought he took ownership, and there was various things. But no, it was thanks to Uncle Jacob that, well, he wasn't married, and so he was able to help his nephews. And but it's quite sad in a way that, you know, if it hadn't been for that sort of family established, then, you know, it wouldn't have been possible to do all the things that Dad did. But I mean, the Murrays were established, you go back to 1850s and walking the show to air and winning the championship and turning down £100 offer for her. And I remember Janet Osborne saying, oh yes, the Murrays, they were the first family in the district to have a sewing machine, and they didn't make enough money off these fancy cows. Yeah. And these 5 daughters, and they were all into this Ayrshire embroidery and things. Mm-hmm. So one of the things, I presume it would be a Singer sewing machine, but it was one of the very early ones. So, you know, they had made good, as it were, for a while. But why they persisted in farming out their children. I mean, Aunt Annie and Uncle Jacob were sent to the unmarried uncle at Carston just because he needed somebody. I think it would be after his father died, and a man couldn't live on his own. So, and I mean, they would be teenagers, I think. But Aunt Chrissy, the youngest daughter, was sent to the aunt at the Common, and she was only 10. And she was, I know, and imagine being plucked from a bosom of 5 sisters, you know, a family, and there'd be fun and games and companionship, and left with this. And she was very severe, this Smith woman, this aunt. She was very, very straight-laced and things, and she, of course, had lost her husband, who was killed in when he was struck by the goods train, and left her with this. I thought he was a toddler, but he was 9. James Clark was 9-year-old when his father was killed, but he was about 10 years older than Aunt Chrissy. But she then had this sort of life of servitude as she was the house. And you see that on the census, when in the 1911 census, she's listed as the servant up at Crossflat at Muirkirk, big farm there. And you've got head of the house is Margaret Clark, and then her son James Clark, he's there, and then Christina Murray, servant, but she's the cousin, and she was the housekeeper and all the rest of it. And then, as I say, he dropped down dead in the burn at Kirkland with a brain hemorrhage at age 62, and left a fortune and 12 farms, and left it all to Aunt Chrissy without ever having told her. So she was left at 41, unmarried, with 12 farms, and had, prior to that, had been just the servant, as it were. Well, I mean, I don't know. Officially, that's it. But I mean, when they went to Kirkland, it was the Duke of Portland's estate, and James Clark wouldn't take it on in condition until the house was all done up. So the whole house was done up about 1914, but it was never touched again. When we were going there in the 1970s, they hadn't had a lick of paint or anything. But you know, they had Rockingham dinner service and fruit, what you call finger bowls and fruits, you know, it was all getting dined, and he had been factors a lot of big estates, and he took up Welsh pony breeding, and he hobnobbed with all the gentry. So he had this. So this was how they were living at Kirkland, which was a massive. And he was one of the top blackface breeders. He was topping the sales at Lanark and things, and the days when, you know, post World War I, there was a boom until the Depression hit. So that's why when he died about 1923 or something, he left £65,000 or something. But I looked it up; it's about 2.5 million or something in today's money. But of course, he wasn't married and had no family. And then after that, Aunt Chrissy married her accountant, which was probably a mistake. But she was Mrs. Gordon. They lived apart, and they got separated, but she was Mrs. Gordon to her dying day.
Robert, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing your memories with us today.
Okay.